by my calculations, I think it's time for another lesson. So today, we are going to be learning about characteristics of ecosystems. So we're going to be starting chapter 4, talking about specifically ecosystems, various characteristics of ecosystems, and then ecosystems which in the larger scheme of the biosphere in terms of biomes. So when we talk about ecosystems, ecosystems don't just start and stop. There's actually a little transition area, and that's called an ecotone. So an ecotone would be a transition area where two ecosystems join. So essentially where a grassland would become a forest. It doesn't just stop grassland forest, there's a little transition area. These areas tend to have the greatest biodiversity because they can support grassland individuals and it can also support forest individuals. We can get organisms from both ecosystems supported in these areas. And once again, they're called ecotones. Organisms' roles within an ecosystem, so everything they do to survive or reproduce, or their role or their job in the ecosystem, this is called their niche. Organisms that are better equipped with their roles or adaptations that support their roles are more likely to survive in their ecosystems. And the stranger the niche you have, the more likely you are to survive. So for example, if we have two birds of prey, a hawk and an owl, those two competing against each other, that's not very good for either of them. So instead, they change their niches a little bit. So hawks hunt during the day, owls hunt at night. But even gets stranger. What about, say, the dung beetle, right? What's the dung beetle doing? It's rolling up dung. Any other organism doing that? No, not really. So since they have a really specific and kind of strange niche, no one else is really competing with the dung beetle. So once again, their ecological niche, anything the organism will do to survive or reproduce, it's kind of like its role or what role it plays within the ecosystem. So if we look here at an organism's biotic potential, so an organism's biotic potential is simply the maximum number of organisms, the maximum number of offspring that a species can produce. And it's determined by four things here. So it's determined by birth potential, capacity for survival, breeding frequency, and the length of reproductive life. So birth potential, how many offspring do you have per birth? Humans, 1, maybe 2. Insects, a lot. Capacity for survival, how often will those organisms reach reproductive age? Humans quite often, insects not so much. Breeding frequency, how many times a year will the species reproduce? And finally, the length of reproductive life. So when does the organism reach sexual maturity and the number of years that the individual can reproduce for? You factor all of these things together, and essentially if resources were unlimited and there were no restrictions, what would be your biotic potential? That's kind of what I'm getting at. But as we know, there are restrictions. There are things called limiting factors. We have factors that limit the growth of the population. So, what are some examples of these limiting factors? We have density independent and dependent factors, and all of these factors essentially push down the populations to reach a point called the carrying capacity. It's the amount of species that the ecosystem can support. So things like fires, floods, hurricanes, they're all factors that will affect a population. It doesn't matter the population size. They could be small, they could be large, doesn't matter the population size. They're going to be affected by a fire or a flood, etc. Density dependent factors are factors that affect a population because of its size. So if you have too many deer, we now have competition. Competition for food, competition for resources, competition for shelter, competition for mates. Since there's more deer, there's more likely there's going to be a bacteria infection or some type of parasite infection. So because the population is so large, we now have these issues. Versus, doesn't matter if the population is large or small, that factor is going to affect it. And overall, it's going to limit our population size, usually keeping that population near the ecosystem's carrying capacity. Now we're going to get into terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. And just for the rest of this lesson, I want to talk about biomes. So I'm going to talk about biomes here. So what a biome is essentially ecosystems grouped into small regions, which are composed either of the lithosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere. So these ecosystems put together into biomes that make up the biosphere. Each biome has essentially major species that are found within it, and then we have various ecosystems within that biome. So if we think back to that chart I showed you a few lessons ago, we start with organism, then we go to population, then community, then ecosystem, then we put the ecosystems together, we get biomes, then we put the biomes together within the biosphere. Here are Canada's four main terrestrial biomes. We have the tundra, the taiga, the temperate deciduous forest, and the grasslands. And then for aquatic biomes, we have a marine water biome as well as a saltwater biome. So, there we go. So Alberta, if we look at it close to home here, Alberta has two main biomes, the taiga and the grassland. Now within the taiga biome, we of course have the taiga ecosystem. So this would be, think northern Alberta, along the Rockies, coniferous trees, adapted to warm, moist summers, cold, dry winters, lots of shade-loving plants because the trees are so large, shrubs, mosses, etc. In terms of animals, we're going to find moose and bulls and deer. We're going to find other predators like black bears and grizzly bears, weasels, owls, and this guy here, it's a wolverine. All right, also within the taiga biome, we have the muskeg ecosystem. So if you go even farther up north, kind of like Athabasca area, you'll find that in these warmer ecosystems, the permafrost starts to melt, but the soil doesn't drain very well. We get these kind of the needles from the pine trees. So now we have this acidic soil that doesn't drain very well, and we get these kind of swampy, boggy areas. There's a lot of decomposing material and peat forming here, and especially in the summer, we have this muskeg forming, which is the swampier, boggy area. Within the muskeg ecosystem, we'll find plants like lichens, tall grasses, shrubs, smaller coniferous trees. The pools of water are great for black flies and mosquitoes, so insects love the muskeg. Next, the grassland ecosystem, that's here in southern Alberta, so this would be the ecosystem we are most familiar with. Fertile soil, short grasses, warm temperatures. In terms of the organisms we find here, a lot of rough fescue, wheat, speargrass, deer, squirrels, rabbits, birds, snakes. And then on the outer rim of the grassland biome, we'll find the deciduous forest ecosystem. So we're gonna have some deciduous forests spread out through the grasslands here. We're gonna have some poplar trees, some birch trees. These always seem kind of weird because we have these like forests kind of on the edge of the grassland. It seems like they're just kind of out of place. These forests are different than the ones up north because the leaves are bigger, they get more sunlight, they can have more moisture, maximizing light and growth. Usually we're going to find them near rivers, lakes, or ponds. And also we're going to find a variety of species that we'd find in the grassland as well as within the trees here. And then we have the levels as well within this ecosystem. So that's about it for the biomes. So we're just going to focus pretty much on the biomes here in Alberta in terms of this course. Next lesson, we're going to get into some factors that affect terrestrial ecosystems. We're going to talk about some different factors that might cause an ecosystem to change and some factors that affect just land ecosystems. And then we'll get into some factors that affect aquatic ecosystems. So, thanks again for watching, and we'll chat soon.